When the scene opens, our forefather Jacob has paused in his journey on the trip he's taking from Beersheba to Haran. The road is long and the travel is difficult and the sun is going down. The reason for Jacob's journey is twofold. He's moving deliberately toward the nomadic communities of northern Mesopotamia to find a wife from among the tribes specified by his father. But he's also moving swiftly because he was trying to get away from something back home. His twin brother, Esau. Esau, whom he had outwitted at every turn. Esau, whom he had manipulated and taken advantage of to obtain an undeserved birthright and an unearned fortune. Esau was after him, with vengeance and violence on his mind. And so Jacob was moving quickly, scrambling toward a future that held great promise and racing away from a past that held peril and danger. And so as he stopped for the night in an unremarkable place with no name, Jacob lay down to sleep with a stone for a pillow, and he dreamed. In that dream, Jacob saw a vision, a celestial ladder that stretched from earth up to heaven, with angels climbing and descending its luminous rungs. And as he awoke, alone in the darkness, he could not help exclaiming, "Aha! God is in this place, and I had no idea." That moment with the ladder is a watershed of Jacob's transformation into the boy he was, becoming the man he will be. Jacob the cynic becomes a believer. Jacob the egotist is finally made humble. Jacob the escape artist is content at last to be held tightly in the arms of something larger and more powerful than himself. This moment of personal change is pivotal to what we know about Jacob's character and his legacy. But for the rabbis of antiquity, this moment with the ladder is significant for another reason. The rabbis point out in the Talmud that while all of the patriarchs, Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, while all of them had powerful and enduring connections with God, Jacob deserves special mention because he did something that no one else in his family or his tribe had been able to do before. Jacob found God in the darkness. Jacob was the first one whose story teaches that we can come to know the presence of something holy when it's dark. Jacob's legacy isn't only about the way that self-centeredness can give way to an expansive heart. It teaches us also about how the cultivation of faith during the times of the soul's deepest darkness can make us into something new. That's the sort of awakening that can become a source of courage that makes it possible for us to tell a story about our life that has always been yearning to be told. Jacob's ladder is a reminder for us to return to the big questions that accompany us on our lives' journey. What would you do if you had more courage? What things do you feel unable to accomplish because you lack the strength and fortitude to do so? When I talk about courage on this particular bima, at this particular night, in this particular year of our temple's history, I'm not talking about heroism or about the kind of bravery that appears when you temporarily convince yourself that you cannot fail. I'm not talking about the kind of New Age positive thinking that refuses to admit that failure is a possibility, a kind of mind over matter that you use to suppress fear. Instead, I'm talking about the specific sort of courage that is demonstrated when we decide that we might fail but we are willing to try anyway. It's a certain kind of courage that is made manifest in the willingness to risk loss or shame or embarrassment or disappointment. When we're willing to risk pain because the possibility of joy and fulfillment and connection on the other side of it will be worth the trade. If you've ever tended a plant that has grown to the point of outgrowing its pot, you know that at a certain point you have only two choices. You can move the plant to a larger pot, or you can let it die. Both of those options will bring stress on the plant, but only one of them will allow the plant to grow into what it was meant to become, ever since it was a tiny seed. It's a kind of courage that can be found in moments when you discover your deepest values, when you recognize without deception and without pretending the clear outlines of the things that you cannot compromise if you wish to remain living as your truest self. That process by which our courage metabolizes stress into progress is called leadership. Tonight, we honor our past presidents. Tonight, we recognize the families of our founders. All of them have found themselves in unique times that required that sort of courage. Tonight, we celebrate their examples and remember their leadership that allowed them to keep their highest values in sight, regardless of the pressures mounting around them, the kind that allowed them to stay calm in the face of gathering storms stirring up around them. Every president of this congregation at one time or another had to rise to an occasion when leadership was thrust upon them, whether they wanted it or not. Every president of this congregation has had their leadership shaped and defined by factors they never expected or planned for. But all of them and all of the 190 families that founded this congregation can affirm that it is at the times when risk is involved that one's truest self has the opportunity to emerge. This 75th year has been an invitation to look back at the 75 years of our temple's history, to consider the things that motivated the men and women who founded Congregation Emanu, what allowed them to help the people around them see a future that didn't yet exist, to convince their community that they held greater, bolder potential than they previously realized. Like our biblical ancestor Jacob, they founded this place because they found themselves simultaneously pushed away from a past that they found untenable and pulled toward a future that was irresistible. Of all the times in American history, Rabbi Walter and I have often remarked together that it is striking that a group of people in 1944 made the decision to form a synagogue, not merely as Jews living in 1944, but as Americans living through the world's most significant and demanding military conflict in history. That war demanded deep and painful sacrifices from our nation, not just from the men on the front lines shipped off to places they had never known, but from the families also they left behind. American households and communities and businesses had to make real sacrifices to support the war effort. And they didn't do it because the sacrifice was immediately and intrinsically fulfilling. They did it because they knew that the stakes of that war were existentially critical to the soul of this country. They knew that for America to remain America, the battle against tyranny had to be won. Historians today still differ about exactly what the outside world knew about the destruction of Europe's Jewry and when they knew it. But what is undebatable is that for Jews living in America in the spring of 1944, the fight against fascism was not theoretical or ideological, it was personal. It isn't overly dramatic to say that the survival of our people, the survival of our families, depended on every diplomatic twist and military turn of events. That was the moral landscape upon which the first moments of our temple's history would be painted. The men and women knew that the fight for democracy overseas would determine the future of Judaism here at home. The battles of Jewish autonomy there couldn't be separated from Jewish life here. Risk, as I said earlier, is often the crucible in which courage is formed. The perils to Western democracy and Jewish self-determination formed the backdrop to the founding of this congregation, and they were principles so vital, so central to who those founders were, that they knew they couldn't be who they were. They couldn't remain true to their principles as Jews and as Americans without finding a spiritual home that embraced those values. The time was pressing, and their options were few. And so even with Rabbi Khan overseas, the man whose leadership they yearned to be at the head of this congregation, even with him overseas, the founders couldn't wait to make this congregation become a reality. And so they drew up documents of formation and formed a congregation for themselves. Even before this temple had a name, before it had a building or a permanent rabbi, that courage was the tiny seed planted by their leadership. Of course, we got our name soon, and the process of choosing a name for the newborn congregation was neither capricious nor haphazard. When Rabbi Khan wrote about it later, he described the choice of a name, Emanu, which means God is with us, this way. He wrote, "Emmanuel was born of a cry for freedom, of pulpit and pew, a concern for Klal Yisrael, the faith of Israel, the land of Israel, the mission of Israel, to bring light to a dark world." Rabbi Khan talked about the spirit that gave birth to this congregation as a light brought into a dark place. The same realization our forefather Jacob had in the depth of night when he exclaimed to himself, "Aha, God is in this place." Sometimes we can't discover who we really are or who we're meant to become until we are plunged into darkness and forced toward a choice between courageous growth and disappearance. And like Jacob, we rarely know the significance of our decision in that moment. It isn't until our children and grandchildren can thank us for our vision and leadership that we know the depths of our courage. And so that's what we are here. We're here to give thanks that at a time of uncertainty and risk, the leaders of this temple chose as their response an inclination toward freedom and autonomy, to choose to seize their unquenchable faith in the freedom of thought and belief, and in the authentic expression of their innermost selves. It's not an accident, I don't think, that the central image of Jacob's dream was a stairway, a ladder, because it reminds us that enlightenment and growth always happens incrementally, one step at a time, one rung above the one behind it. The light that Rabbi Khan held grew stronger and brighter in Rabbi Walter's hands. That light lit the path for the generations of clergy that would follow him. The vision cultivated by the hands of those 190 families is nurtured and fed continually by the generations of leaders who still rise to follow them. This is a night of celebration, and it is a night for thanksgiving. It's a night on which we give thanks to God for those who came before us, and on which we ask from God that those who come after us will similarly be blessed by courage. And so I want to end my remarks this evening with a prayer. And I want to invite those of you that are wearing ribbons marking your membership in the families of those who founded this temple, please to rise. Our God and God of all the ancestors before us, in celebration we come together on this Shabbat to offer praise to you. Our Rock and Redeemer, your steadfast love supports all generations of this congregational family. You give us strength. You endow us with a willingness and determination to continue the work begun 75 years ago by these families. With your guidance, they placed their faith in you, laboring to make your name sacred, and their efforts were not in vain. Through their prayers, their tireless work, and their good example, Congregation Emmanuel has been brought nearer to you, O God, to know you with our deepest selves. May the legacy and the sacred memories of these 75 years uplift and inspire us to continue sustaining this congregation with love and spirit and vigor. May we learn to share its vision with others, and may the sharing become our strength. O God, confirm our hopes and strengthen our devotion, that our heritage may bring us joy and strengthen the generations yet to come. We ask your blessing on this congregation and on those whose vision and values brought it into being. Grant us many more years of growth and flourishing, and may the true meaning of Emmanuel be implanted in our hearts, that God is with us. And through us, may your name be sanctified and magnified forever. Amen. You may remain